Good evening and welcome to OpenSinai.com's first live class. It's really a pleasure to have all of you here to participate in this learning experience. First of all, a note of technical advice. The instructions for how to participate in the class are on the website you're looking at, but in case to just elucidate them, first, you obviously have clicked play because you're looking at the video right now, but after clicking play, click on the lower left-hand corner of the YouTube video screen, which says "Be part of the conversation," and that will open up a new window, and you'll see the video just like you do now, with the addition of different options. And on the upper right-hand corner of those options will be an icon of a grid. 9 buttons, a grid, and then scanation, lower left-hand invitation on the left-hand corner of the YouTube video screen. Then a new window will open, click on the grid on the upper right-hand corner, and then click on Q&A, and then you can ask any question you would like throughout the class. So this Saturday night begins the Jewish fast day of Tisha B'Av, the 9th day of Av. And even though on the Jewish calendar it actually is the 10th day of Av, because the 9th day of Av falls on Shabbat, on the Sabbath, the rabbis pushed off the fast day until the Saturday night, until after Shabbat. And so Jews around the world will commemorate the 9th day of Av beginning this Saturday night. I notice more people joining. I invite you to participate live by following the instructions on the website by clicking on the invitation to participate on the lower left-hand corner of the video screen, and then a new window will open, and then click on the grid icon in the top upper right-hand corner, and then click on Q&A, and that should take you into the interactive element of the screen. So on Tisha B'Av, the 9th day of Av, Jews around the world commemorate the destruction of the 2 temples that once stood in Jerusalem. The last one, the second temple, being destroyed in around 70 CE by the Roman Empire. And in those temples was performed an intricate and elaborate set of rituals, a sacrificial system. And on Tisha B'Av, the pinnacle of mourning, the pinnacle of the experience that people immerse themselves into on that fast day is the experience of mourning those temples. And it would behoove us to spend a little bit of time discussing what is the relevance for us today, people living 2,000 years removed from the temple service. What is the relevance for us today when we examine that sacrificial service? Furthermore, the Bible, the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, spends an inordinate amount of time discussing both the construction of the tabernacle, which then would become the temple in Jerusalem, and the sacrificial system therein. So what we're going to do in this class is we're going to spend a little bit of time delving into those subjects. What is the relevance for all of us today? Let me just load the presentation. One moment. You should be seeing it on your screen in just a moment. So if you look on your screen, you'll see the presentation. And what we're going to do is we're going to explore the debate between Maimonides and Nachmanides, who were 2 classic Jewish philosophers and rabbis and scholars. And they have a classical debate on the subject of the question of sacrifices. We're going to look then at 2 modern approaches of how the modern person living so far removed from the sacrificial system can derive relevance, if there is any relevance, from examining that sacrificial system. And lastly, we're going to take a peek into the sacrifices, the role of the sacrifices in the future in some redemptive messianic vision. And throughout, we'll stop and take questions. So if you have any questions, I encourage you to submit them on the Q&A in the interactive window. And once again, just as a gentle reminder, if you want to participate fully in the class, the instructions to do so are on the screen in front of you. So first of all, we turn to Maimonides. And Maimonides Maimonides was Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, who passed away who was born in 1135 and passed away in 1204. He was born in Cordoba, Spain. He passed away in Egypt, but spent 10 years of his life in Fez, Morocco. He was one of the most important rabbis who ever lived, a Jewish philosopher of extraordinary depth, a physician as well, someone well-versed in a variety of subjects, and composed two primary texts that Jews to this day study in great intensity. One of them is the Mishnah Torah, which is his work that systematically puts together a code of Jewish law. And this book was meant to be accessible to the average layperson, so that they could open this book and they could turn to the appropriate section into the right chapter and discover what they are to do in their lives. Discover what exactly is the right practice in that moment, in any moment, in any type of circumstance throughout their days. It was meant for the average layperson, and it was composed in a simple and easy to understand Hebrew, and was written between 1170 and 1180. So in the Mishnah Torah, in the laws of Me'ilah, and what is Me'ilah, you may ask, this is not our subject, but just so you know, Me'ilah is a section in the book of Leviticus in Vayikra, chapter 5, verse 15, which discusses trespassing and making use of property belonging to first the tabernacle, the Mishkan, and then to the Beit HaMikdash, to the temple. So in discussing that category of laws of which a sacrifice is required to atone for if one trespasses, Maimonides writes the following: "It is said in the Torah, you shall therefore keep all my statutes and all my ordinances and do them." Now, the quote-unquote ordinances are commandments whose reason is obvious. These are commandments which we could understand, we could intuit the reason for their existence quite easily. For example, the commandments to not murder and to not steal are commandments which we get. We understand. They make perfect sense in the construction of a society that operates smoothly, where people are respected, and a society where there be rampant murder and rampant theft would not be a well-functioning society. So those are ordinances. Those are mishpatim in Hebrew. But on the other hand, the statutes, the chukim in Hebrew, the statutes, are commandments whose reason is not known. These are commandments that defy human comprehension. These are commandments that require of us to take a leap of faith. So if you think about it, they hearken back to that first leap of faith, which was in the book of Genesis, where Abraham is commanded by God in the narrative to sacrifice his son Isaac, to sacrifice his son Yitzchak, and he does so. But before he finishes the act and actually completes the sacrifice, before he actually takes his son's life, but he's prepared to do so, an angel of God stops him and says, "You have proven yourself as somebody who fears God." And the Christian European philosopher Kierkegaard, who helped really shape so much of Western philosophy and Western theology, points back to that moment as the classic example, the paradigm of a leap of faith. So that moment is a leap of faith moment, and the statutes, the chukim, are leap of faith commandments, commandments that defy human comprehension. So according to Maimonides, what's an example of one of those commandments? All of the laws concerning the offerings are in the category of statutes. They are commandments that defy human comprehension. The whole idea of taking an animal and bringing it to a temple and sacrificing it, according to Maimonides, defies human rationale. It does not make sense, and it will not make sense. But nonetheless, he concludes in this brief paragraph, this brief quote of his writings, that the sages have said that the world stands because of the service of the offerings. So they defy human comprehension, but yet they are foundational to the existence of the world. That's Maimonides' opinion as expressed in his Mishnah Torah, in his code of Jewish law, meant for the average layperson. Now we turn to another work of Maimonides, another chief primary text that he composed, which is the Guide to the Perplexed, the Moreh Nevuchim. And the Guide to the Perplexed was composed around 1190, so after the Mishnah Torah, and it was written in Judeo-Arabic, as opposed to simple, easy-to-understand Hebrew. So the Guide to the Perplexed, he writes, "It is impossible to go suddenly from one extreme to the other. The nature of man will not allow him suddenly to discontinue everything to which he has been accustomed. The Israelites were commanded to devote themselves to his service, but the general mode of worship in which the Israelites were brought up consisted in sacrificing animals in temples containing images, to bow down to those images, and to burn incense before them." And he continues, "It was in accordance with the wisdom and plan of God that he did not command us to give up and to discontinue all these modes of worship. For to obey such a commandment would have been contrary to the nature of man, who generally clings to that to which he is accustomed. For this reason, God allowed these rituals to continue." What a difference of opinion. In the code, in his legal code, he writes they are foundational, they are eternal, and they defy human comprehension. Whereas in his philosophical work, The Guide to the Perplexed, he tells us essentially that they are rooted in the Egyptian experience. They're rooted in what the Jewish people, as they were leaving Egypt, knew for all of their lives in Egypt, which was a sacrificial cult consisting of temples and sacrifices in those temples by a priesthood, and it would have been impossible. So here Maimonides posits and speculates on the nature of the human condition, that would have been impossible, and it is hard and difficult for a person to go from one extreme to the other. In other words, it's hard for people to change. I know I can relate to that phenomenon. It's hard to change. And so Maimonides says, because it's hard to change, and because this was such an important thing, that God took the people on not only a physical journey out from Egypt on their way to the land of Israel, to the promised land, but he was taking them on an intellectual, emotional, psychological, and religious and spiritual journey as well. That journey started at one point and was leading to another point. And it is clear that Maimonides is saying here that the sacrifices are, in a sense, transitional. They are not the ideal. And not only do they not defy human comprehension, they're quite understandable. They fit within a certain construct of an Egyptian modality that the Jewish people adopted through their servitude and their bondage in Egypt. And it took time and generations to move away from that. So how does one, before we even get into the debate between Maimonides and his chief opponent on most things, Nachmanides, how do we understand this debate within Maimonides himself? Because here we have two polar opposite opinions within the same person. So what do you think? So we're going to take a pause here for a moment, and please submit any speculations you might have on how to reconcile these two opinions, or how not to reconcile these two opinions. And we'll continue in just a moment, but I want to see what you have to say. So let's please submit those questions. And once again, if you're just joining us, to enter into the conversation, once you've clicked play, which you've done because you're watching us, click the Be Part of the Conversation on the lower left-hand corner of the YouTube video, which will open a new window. Then click on the right-hand top icon, the grid icon, the grid of 9 dots, which will then prompt you to press Q&A. Click on Q&A, and you're there. So anyone have any thoughts on how do we reconcile these two approaches? There's silence, which perhaps tells us that it's just obvious to all of you. And that's possible. Maybe it's obvious. So let's think about that for a second. One way of understanding the opinion of this conflict of opinion in Maimonides is, first of all, there's no simple answer, but one way of understanding it is that this text, the Guide to the Perplexed, which was written after the Code of Jewish Law, the Mishnah Torah, was a representation of Maimonides' thinking as it evolved. That he began in his opinion in the Mishnah Torah that they were eternal, and then later in life, a few years later, he concludes his thinking that they're ultimately transitional optional and they're a stage along the process. So that's one way of viewing it. Another way of viewing it is that these texts, the two different texts, the text of the code of Jewish law and the text of this philosophical treatise, represent two very different types of analysis, and they're meant for two very different audiences. The first is meant, as we mentioned, for the layperson, for the person at home who needs to know what to do and perhaps also what to believe. This is the person who spends most of their day earning a livelihood, taking care of their family, who doesn't have the time or the luxury to devote to intricate study of the nature of creation, the nature of God, and of the human condition. And this person needs to have scaffolding of belief and action that allows them to function in their everyday lives. Whereas in the Guide to the Perplexed, that work was written, first of all, in Arabic, a more sophisticated philosophical language at the time, and it was written in more difficult terminology. It was written in a way which was harder to understand, and it was meant for the person who's a student of philosophy, the person who's a student of Jewish texts, who spends their days and their nights studying and pondering the nature of existence, the nature of the human condition, who devotes a lot of time to that inquiry, and so ultimately maybe these are two different layers of understanding, that neither one is true or false, but they could be both true on a spectrum for those who are on different levels of ability to study and who have time to study, and different occupations. Those are two approaches to how to reconcile and how to understand this conflict within Maimonides himself. Now we turn from outside Maimonides and we look at Nachmanides. So who is Nachmanides? Nachmanides was Rabbi Moses ben Nachman, who was born in 1194 and passed away in 1270. He spent most of his life in Gerona, Catalonia, Spain, and he died in the land of Israel in 1270. And he, as opposed to Maimonides, who was most interested in understanding things from a philosophical bent, from looking at things from the perspective of philosophy, and from looking at things from the perspective of rationalism, Nachmanides was through and through a mystic. Nachmanides was somebody who looked at the world through an esoteric lens, who was focused on understanding the hidden, the not revealed aspects of creation. And so naturally, these two different orientations would run into conflict with each other. And oftentimes they did. So Nachmanides, when commenting on understanding sacrifices, begins in his commentary in Leviticus by saying right out off the bat, Maimonides' statements are preposterous. In other words, he disagrees sharply with Maimonides. And so what does he understand the role of the sacrifices to be? So he offers the following idea. He says that a more acceptable rationale is the one set out as follows. Seeing that human conduct is expressed in thought, speech, and action, God instituted that a person who has committed a transgression and offers a sacrifice shall place his hands on it, symbolizing the deed, make a confession as a reminder of the mused power of speech, and burn with a fire the bowels and the kidneys, which are the organs of thought and lust, and the blood shall be sprinkled on the altar, representing his lifeblood. So he conceives of human activity in the world through three different realms. What we think, what we say, and that the various rituals that are done in the sacrificial order are symbolic of those three realms. When one places their hands on the animal to be sacrificed, they symbolize the deed they now regret. When one makes the verbal confession of what they now have remorse for, they are connecting that to the speech that was uttered in the action they regret. And most powerfully, when one takes that animal and burns it on the altar, they are representing the life. They are representing life. And he continues and says that all of this should make him realize that having sinned against God with his body and soul, he would deserve to have his blood spilled and his body burnt. However, God in his infinite mercy accepts this substitute for an atonement. What a powerful moment for the person who accepts this construct, for the person who approaches the sacrifices in this way. That would be a profound religious and psychological moment of atonement, of finding cleansing, that they would visualize and transfer themselves onto that animal. And when they watch that animal burn up in ash, and the ash ascend, the cloud ascend into the sky, they see themselves in that action. And they literally burn away what they regret. They transfer it onto that animal, and then they burn it away. And so for Nachmanides, the sacrifices do not defy human comprehension. The sacrifices are quite easy to understand because they fit within the realm of the human condition, that we have three realms of activity: thought, speech, and action, and the sacrifices correspond to those three realms, and they offer to the person who's willing to accept this construct an ultimate modality of atonement. They offer to that person a way to find for themselves wholeness and repair from the actions they have committed. So to sum up these two opinions, Maimonides, first of all, disagrees with himself. Opinion number one, as expressed in the Mishnah Torah, has him saying that they are eternal and that they are foundational. They are a chok, they are a statute that defies human comprehension, but they are a foundation of the world's existence, and that they will last forever. Whereas in his opinion number two, in the Guide to the Perplexed, in the Moreh Nevuchim, he asserts that they are a concession to human nature, that they are rooted and modeled after the Egyptian experience, and that ultimately they are a transitional period to something other, to something greater than the sacrificial system of animals. And then Maimonides, in contrast to Nachmanides asserts that they are spiritually nourishing and that they are connected intimately to the three areas of human activity. They atone for human thought, human speech, and human action that we have come to regret. So we'll pause here again if there's any questions you might have before we move on to modern approaches to how to grapple with the role of sacrifices in a world far removed from sacrifices. So I see two questions, and Tikva, you're right. It seems that it's very hard to reconcile the two opinions within Maimonides himself. And that's why there's ultimately no simple answer for how we can find a resolution between these two contrasting opinions. And I think another deeper layer of understanding it is that ultimately we as people can sometimes say contradictory things. That in our own lives, we think about ourselves as individuals, we're not always consistent in the things we say. And that sometimes it represents a continuity of thought, a development of thought, an evolution of thought. And other times, it might just represent different audiences that we're speaking to. And at other times, it might just be two different moments, and we might not even be connecting them in our own heads. So it's really difficult for academics and scholars and rabbis who have studied this to try and come to any concrete, definitive conclusion for how do we reconcile these two opinions, because maybe there is no reconciliation. Maybe there is no resolution. Maybe ultimately they just are two different opinions. But what I presented, the two possible resolutions, are popular ones, and they do have some elements of compellingness to them. And the question asked by Lauren Davis, hi Lauren, about how is this like the kaparot before Yom Kippur, about the kaparot, for those who are not familiar, this is a ritual that developed throughout Jewish history, that there is this custom before Yom Kippur to take, well, it depends on your custom, to take either a live bird or to take currency, to take coins, and to symbolically transfer one's regret, one's remorse, one's actions that they have come to know, to wish for atonement for, and transfer it to either that animal or those coins, and through a evocative ritual to affect that transference and find some sense of atonement leading into Yom Kippur. And so in Nachmanides' formulation, Lauren, they're connected, because Nachmanides says that the sacrifices connect to our activities and that they're atonement for the way we act in the world. And the kaparot that one does before Yom Kippur are also connected to our activities, whether speech or action or thought, and they're another way of transference of those actions. And in fact, if the custom is one has to do it with a live animal, that animal is traditionally then slaughtered, and the food is fed to the poor. So one both accomplishes watching the animal pass away in the sense that Nachmanides formulates, and does a mitzvah feeding people who need food. I see another question here from Moshe Kassover. Let me just read it for one moment. It's a longer one. How do you reconcile the Rambam that you quoted with the following from the guide? It is inconceivable that the commandments are dependent on time and place, but they're universal. This implication there is that the commandments are meant to amend human nature, which is not changed. That is a fantastic question, Moshe, and I really appreciate you bringing it up. And it actually connects to sometimes the difficulty of reconciling different parts of Rambam, different parts of Maimonides with himself. And what you've brought to us actually further illustrates that point, that even within the guide, there is also this sense of contradiction. And I'm grateful for you bringing that, because it only further illustrates the point that ultimately it's really hard to understand what the Rambam Maimonides actually believed. And one thing I would encourage all of us, at any time you read an opinion where someone asserts that Maimonides held X or Y for certainly the role of sacrifices or other things, to take it with a grain of salt, because ultimately the Rambam Maimonides is very hard to understand. Very difficult to understand indeed. Thank you for those questions. We're going to move on to the next section, which is, let me just load it, which is looking at two modern approaches to this question, and coming from two different perspectives and two different vantage points. One we're going to look at is from Samuel David Luzzatto, Shmuel David Luzzatto, who is known by his acronym Shadal, Shmuel Shah David Da Luzzatto Al Shadal, who was born in 1800 in the city of Trieste in Italy, and passed away in 1865 in Padua, also in northern Italy. And he was a member of the movement of Wissenschaft der Judentum, which is a really complicated German term. Essentially, it was a 19th century pursuit that was very popular in Central and Western Europe at the time, to look at Judaism and Jewish texts through the lens of critical biblical scholarship, and using, to whatever extent possible, the scientific method. And he was also a linguist. He was a student of Hebrew grammar, and spent a lot of his life trying to understand deeply the roots of the Bible and the Torah. And while he was a staunch member of this Enlightenment movement of Jewish critical scholarship, he was also in his own life a deeply pious and religious individual who, as an interesting side point, rejected philosophical conceptions of the nature of people, and found that Jewish tradition offered the most compelling notions of creation of the human condition, because he felt that philosophy didn't, and he claimed that he studied all modes of philosophy, that philosophy did not engender enough compassion for others, that Jewish tradition ultimately engendered that intense sense of compassion and dignity for other people. And the other opinion we're going to look at is from the other side of the spectrum, Rabbi David Tzvi Hoffman, who was born in Vienna, not Vienna, but in Austria in 1843, and passed away in Berlin in 1921. And he was a rabbi, a scholar, and the Rosh Yeshiva, the rabbinic dean of the Rabbinical Seminary of Berlin, which was also known as the Hildesheimer Rabbinical Seminary. He succeeded in that position after his mentor and his teacher and his Rabbi Azriel Hildesheimer, passed away, of which the school is named after. And Rabbi Hoffman also, before that, spent time in the city of Frankfurt, where he was a teacher in the schools of Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, who was one of the most important rabbinic figures in Germany, in addition to Rabbi Hoffman, of the 19th century, who was a proponent of a synthesis of modernity with Judaism, of classic scholarship of Judaism. And Rabbi Hoffman was also a student of the Wissenschaft der Judentum, of looking at a critical analysis, scholarly analysis of Judaism, but he rejected a lot of its conclusions, obviously, and he mostly employed it in the realm of oral law, in the realm of Talmud, and hesitated to approach it in the realm of the Bible itself. And what was unique about his rabbinical school was that it was the first rabbinical seminary to train rabbis, not only just in the classic curriculum that rabbis were trained in to become rabbis, but also to train them in the knowledge of biblical scholarship, in the knowledge of the academy of the university, so that these emerging young rabbis, they enter the field in their positions, in their pulpits throughout Central and Western Europe, would be able to have converse with their lay people who are reading articles and journals of what was intensely popular and widely circulated positions that were emanating out of the university. So let's first take a look at the opinion of Samuel David Luzzatto. And this comes from his introduction to the book of Leviticus, Leviticus 1:1. And he writes, "If the Torah stated that God does not want sacrifices and offerings, the people would soon say, 'It is of no concern to the Lord whether we act righteously or strive for self-perfection.' Had the Torah commanded only to pray, sing God's praises, read the Torah, and listen to ethical lessons and sermons, and not given us the sacrificial laws, then the fear of God and his greatness would not have penetrated into the hearts of the masses." So ultimately, what is Luzzatto offering here? What is his position? He is ultimately saying that the sacrificial system cultivates a certain moral heart. It cultivates a notion, a powerful notion, that God cares about what we do, that God is invested in our actions in this world, that even though we can seem sometimes be so insignificant, living on this planet which is floating in this galaxy, and ultimately seem like we don't matter, that ultimately our actions matter a great deal, that what we do matters, and what is evident to that is the fact that when we do something that transgresses, God commands us to atone for it, because if God did not care, God would not seek our atonement. And so if the Torah had only commanded ethical lessons, or only told us to praise God or to offer prayers or worship, and not had incorporated, which is really the bulk of the Torah, the sacrificial system, then we would not have been properly imprinted with this notion that God cares, which therefore cultivates a certain moral heart, which then helps really shape our interpersonal relations. It shapes how we act in the world, not only in public where other people see, but also in private, in our own inner chambers. It helps us really inculcate a certain personality, a religious persona. So for Luzzatto, the sacrifices are integral to the functioning of the human being. They're integral to the cultivation of a refined personality, of someone who knows that someone is watching them, that God cares for them, that God cares what they do, and God seeks atonement from them when they fall short. We turn now to Rabbi Hoffman, who asserts the following opinion. And this also comes from Rabbi Hoffman's introduction to the book of Leviticus. Obeying the divine command and ready to carry it out, he, Abraham, is ordered to preserve his son's life. So now we're hearkening back, as we did earlier, to the Akedat Yitzchak, to the binding of Isaac, and that moment being a paradigm for a certain type of behavior. And so Abraham is ready to carry out God's command. Just then a ram appears, and Abraham sacrifices it in his son's stead. This experience illustrates the idea of full submission and total obedience to the divine will, which is the ultimate purpose of man's life through an animal sacrifice. This is the compliance that God demands of us. That is what fear of God means, boundless obedience to God's will. So for Rabbi Hoffman, the sacrifices are also integral. The sacrifices help inculcate an obedience heart. They help inculcate a sense that we have something greater to ourselves by which we owe our fidelity, to which we owe our loyalty and allegiance, and that there is a value to shaping a religious personality which has within it the characteristic of submission. So granted, depending where you are in your life and where you approach theological language, this either resonates with you or doesn't resonate with you. But if you look at it from the lens of what it means to cultivate a heart that has fidelity, a heart that has loyalty, that can transcend one's own self, and even take that leap of faith moment, a leap of faith in believing in something greater than you, then the question becomes, is there something relevant for you in your life to this text? Does this speak to you? So let's pause again before we move on. If you have any questions on these two texts, or tell us how this speaks to you or doesn't speak to you with what Luzado has said or what Rabbi Hoffman has said. So, Lauren, you asked the question that you thought prayer is supposed to take the place of sacrifices in post-temple Judaism. And you are correct that prayer does take the place of sacrifices in post-temple Judaism. And just to be clear, there are no sacrifices being offered in any synagogue anywhere in the Jewish world that I'm aware of, and I'm pretty sure that's the case. But yet the sacrifices, the study of them, and using them prayerfully in our text is central in the traditional Jewish liturgy, that they open our morning prayers every day, and they're integrated and woven into the Jewish prayer book, the traditional Jewish prayer book throughout. And the sacrifices, the study of them, it remains to this very day an important element of Jewish practice and Jewish study. So let's move on to the next topic, which is looking at sacrifices in the future. And this topic we're only going to touch because this topic is really multifaceted and multivocal. It's complex and it's nuanced, and ultimately it's speculation, because we only know what will happen in the future by being in the future. So we don't really know what will happen, but nonetheless, looking at a couple of opinions in the rabbinic tradition for what might happen in the messianic future in regard to sacrifices could be instructive for us as we study this subject. But before we begin that, it's important to know that there are Jews throughout the world who are actively working to build and rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, and are actively working to restore the sacrificial system. Specifically, there's an institute in Jerusalem that it lives in the old city of Jerusalem that has already made many of the temple vessels and utensils. And every year before Passover, it does a mock paschal sacrifice, full sacrifice in all, with a priesthood that they're training in order to offer sacrifices in a rebuilt temple. So before we even discuss what sacrifice in the future might look like, I thought it'd be helpful to take a moment and watch this promotional video that this institute put out, so that you get a sense of what is the emotional reality motivating people in this active building project. Where are they coming from? Because you can often gain a deeper understanding of the motivations of people by looking at what they put out in their promotional material. So we're going to watch this video together, and then we'll discuss it for a moment. So this video, first of all, it's well done from a production point of view. But what is it showing? It's showing that initially there are people who are in conflict with each other, people who are being a bit aggressive with each other, a person who's immersed in the study of traditional Judaism, but whose head is down in the text, and two generations of people who don't understand each other, the young and the old. And what happens in this rebuilt temple? The world is radically transformed. That young and old gather together, that they're able to transcend the differences of generations and they unite, that the conflict, the bickering comes to an end and people come together in unity and harmony, and that this all is manifest around the reconstruction of the temple, of a third temple, and that part and parcel with the restoration of the sacrificial system is ultimately a total revolution in the way we operate in the world and the way human society is constructed. So part and parcel of a rebuilt sacrificial system comes along with it notions of prosperity, of peace, of harmony, of brotherhood and sisterhood, of old and young uniting together. It's a powerful vision, which is no surprise captivates many people to the extent that there are those who are actively working towards its rebuilding. So let's take a look at two sources which discuss what those sacrifices might look like in the future. One is from Vayikra Rabbah, from Leviticus Rabbah, which is the Midrash, which is the rabbinic homiletics on the Torah, which was put together in text form, published in either the 5th or 7th century, and originated in the land of Israel and Eretz Yisrael. And Vayikra Rabbah, the following image is presented. Rabbi Pinchas, Rabbi Levi, and Rabbi Yochanan, in the name of Rabbi Menachem of Galilea, proclaimed in the future, all the sacrifices will be annulled, but the thanksgiving offering will not be annulled. Similarly, all the prayers will be annulled, except the thanksgiving prayers will not be annulled. So in this redemptive future, in this messianic vision, all the prayers that we utter and all the sacrifices that we would bring will be gone, except for those that express the notion of Todah Rabbah, that express the notion of gratitude, that express the notion of thanksgiving. And so one can imagine the world that one would live in order for this to be true. It's a world that has no need. It's a world that has no need for requests, a world of no poverty, a world of no hunger, a world of no strife and bickering, a world where we do not need to regret anything because we've done nothing wrong, a world in which the only thing we need to say or do is offer our thanksgiving for the creation of that world. This is a radical conception of what the world will look like in the messianic time. It is drastically different from our existence, and in that world, the only offerings that would be offered would be an offering of thanksgiving. And now let's take a look at the opinion of a more modern opinion from the 19th and 20th century, from Rabbi Abraham Isaac HaKohen Cook, who was born in 1865, passed away in 1935, and he was the first Ashkenazic chief rabbi of British Mandate Palestine of the land of Israel. And he spent his life focused on this process of connecting the Jewish people once again to the Jewish homeland and the redemptive, the mystical undertones that went along with that. And he was intimately invested in the national project of rebuilding the Jewish homeland and restoring Jewish sovereignty in that homeland. And so in his writings, which span a spectrum of thought and really range from the most practical to the most esoteric, he offers the following idea. In the writing of the Kabbalists, we find a remarkable description of how the universe will look in the future. A world vastly changed from our current reality. Human beings will no longer need to take the lives of animals for their physical, moral, and spiritual needs. The prophet Malachi similarly foretold of a lofty world in which the temple service will only consist of grain offerings in place of the animal sacrifices of old. Then the grain offerings of Judah and Jerusalem will be pleasing to God as in the days of old and in the ancient years. So what is he saying here? He's saying that not only will we not need to sacrifice animals in the future, we will not need to rely on them for our physical sustenance or for any moral needs or spiritual needs. And if you remember back to Genesis, in the account of creation, when the first human is created, God in the biblical narrative ordains that they are allowed to eat all the fruit and vegetables of the world. And only after the flood is Noah commanded that he is allowed to eat of the meat, allowed to eat of the flesh of animals. And so perhaps what Rabbi Cook is alluding to is that we'll return back to the idyllic state of Gan Eden, that idyllic state of the Garden of Eden. And in that a world of Eden, we will no longer need to rely on animals. We will no longer crave to eat animals. We'll no longer need them to atone. We won't have to transfer our misdeeds onto them, but we'll be elevated and our religious personalities will be refined to such an extent that we will not even need them in any regard whatsoever. And in fact, he cites the prophet Malachi, who, when he talks about the restoration of the sacrifices, he only mentions grain offerings, vegetarian vegetable offerings in that quote, and not anything about animal sacrifices. So obviously this is just a drop in the bucket when looking at the role of sacrifices in the future. As we mentioned, it's a very complex subject and ultimately a speculative subject. But what it does tell us is that Jewish tradition continues has grappled and continues to grapple with the question of sacrifices, juxtaposed to our modern sensibilities, which as time progresses, we become more and more removed from the notion of sacrifices. And in that removal, we continue to raise questions about what possible relevance and role they might have, whether or not their role is one that cultivates an obedient heart or a role that cultivates a moral heart, whether they're transitional or whether they're eternal, whether they're a concession to human nature or whether they're integral to how we live with the nature we have and express our atonement through them. Ultimately, it's a very rich subject and one that I hope throughout this learning experience together in our first OpenSinai.com class that you have come away with some ideas, some thoughts to ponder. And if you are observing the fast day of Tisha B'Av this Saturday night through Sunday night, I wish you a meaningful fast. I wish you a fast which brings you to heightened elevation of sense of purpose and brings you to deeper understandings of self and your role in the world and a role of repair of the world in need of so much repair, so much brokenness in the world. And I invite you to join us at our next class as we launch our second class next month on August 19th, 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, again on the topic of unlocking Jewish prayer, preparing for the high holidays, in which we'll look at different conceptions of Jewish prayer and trying to understand what are we meant to accomplish when we open our prayer books. We're about to spend hours and hours, for those of us who will observe and celebrate the holidays in synagogues. What are we meant to accomplish in that process? So I hope you can join us for that class as well. And once again, if you would like to watch this class or want to share it with your friends or family, it will be archived in our website in just a short moment and available to watch at your convenience on your phone, laptop, or a tablet. Wishing you a great evening and thank you for joining us at our inaugural OpenSinai.com class.